Everyone has got a dream. You know what I mean.
Hello DPUK. This is Greg Parker coming to you from Australia, and I'm going to be running you through my book, Lee Harvey Oswald's Cold War. I've often been asked why I started the book in Colombia, and especially so going back to the early 1900s. The reasons for that are twofold. Firstly, you cannot really understand the Cold War without understanding concepts of American exceptionalism and manifest destiny. And these concepts were in abundance in Colombia at the time. Many examples exist through the efforts of United Fruit, the State Department, the Marines, the FBI, and later the CIA. The two goals of Manifest Destiny and American exceptionalism are to remake the world in the image of the US and to exempt the US from international law. We see lots of echoes of that today as well. So that's the bigger picture. The more specific reason for hanging out in Colombia is the assassination of Jorge Gaitán. Gaitán is remembered in that country as their own JFK, but they have that wrong. He was their own RFK. He was young, charismatic, and favoured to win the upcoming election. He was also assassinated in a public place at close range with a pistol by a young, disenfranchised male who was a member of the San Jose-based AMORC religion and was also practicing self-hypnosis. So not only did Gaitán resemble RFK, his alleged assassin, Juan Roa Sierra, could have been a clone of Saran Saran. What did reflect the JFK case was the actual aftermath, in that the government inquiry was widely regarded as a cover-up. So to get around that, they engaged a team from Scotland Yard to review their own investigation. I mean, everyone trusts Scotland Yard, right? So if they give the verdict that Roa was a lone nut, that should be the end of it. But what happened was this: the detectives were not allowed to generate their own leads, and nor could they look at any documents or evidence that were not used in the original government inquiry. Given those restrictions, they could do nothing more than rubber stamp that original verdict, which is what they did. And that too is what the Warren Commission did with the FBI report. It was basically a rubber stamp. Lastly, on Gaitán, I'd like to add that I believe my book gives the only complete and accurate resolution of that assassination, right down to who was behind it, who actually pulled the trigger, and how Roa was recruited and made a patsy. I hope that I can do the same for the JFK assassination by the end of the 3 volumes, or 4, depending on how it goes. Okay, in part 2, the first half of that part is looking mainly at the Korean War. Some of the conclusions I reached included that biological weapons were actually used against the North Koreans. That in itself is immaterial to the book. What I want to point out is how the press was used to soften the US population to accept the coming use of those weapons in Korea. The use of the press to get people used to an idea or to accept certain things is a big issue, both inside and outside assassination law. But what I want to do is go through some of those stories, and we'll start with March 12, 1949. United Press reported James Forrestal as stating that the US leads the war in germ warfare research. That germ weapons are definitely not the fantastic killers they've been labelled, but could be a cheap and most important means of warfare. That was followed on May 27, 1949, by a report from former chief of the Airborne Infection Project at the US Biological Warfare Headquarters at Camp Dietrich, Dr. Theodore Rosebery. Dr. Rosebery stated that the practicality of germ warfare cannot be proven unless it is used in war. He also warns that defence against biological weapons as a whole is pitiably weak, so weak that none of us, civilians or military, can find much comfort in that prospect. So that's a pretty dire warning right there. Then on July 21, 1949, we have the AP reporting that the Army had asked Congress for an extra $3.3 million to improve both the defensive and offensive aspects of war with bioweapons. Then on September 10, 1949, we have the AP reporting the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Brock Chisholm, declared that biological weapons would make large armies, navies and air forces obsolete, along with the atomic bomb. So we go from dire reports to, hey, this is great stuff, it'll make the atom bomb obsolete, we should embrace it. Then on July 25, 1950, the undeclared war in Korea begins, so that was widely reported at that time. Then on July 26, 1950, United Press reports that defensive measures against germ warfare are being drawn up. The scientist being quoted is familiar with the program and adds that they include no new rays or other magic means of coping with germs. Instead, the measures would consist of training health officers in known medical and public health practices and on an emergency basis only. That's followed on November 3rd, 1950, with a report that the armed forces are looking ahead to wars fought with radiological and poison weapons, germ warfare, guided missiles and special devices to make maps of enemy terrain under cover of night or clouds. So it's a pretty bright future in 1950 for war. December 28, 1950, UP reports that the federal government is urging civil defence workers to prepare for nerve gas and germ warfare attacks upon American cities. The story adds that a manual issued by the Health Resources Division states that the automatic detection devices are essential for adequate protection, but it anonymously concludes that such devices are not available at any cheap price, which would make their purchase and use for civil defence practicable. So what they're in effect saying is that, hey guys, you're on your own after all. We're probably going to be attacked and we can't afford to protect you. And that's the design of these stories, it appears. The US has the most advanced germ warfare program in the world. It wants to use that program in a defensive manner only, but is carefully leaving the door ajar for a first strike option. We also learn that the program needs to be evaluated under combat conditions. Next, we are treated to the prospect that the US will probably soon suffer a germ warfare attack, followed by the awful truth that civil defence is inadequately trained and equipped to cope with such an attack. Once these seeds have been planted in the population, the individual reader is left to conclude for themselves that a preemptive strike is really the only viable option. We have to get them first because they're going to get us and we can't protect ourselves. But first things first, as the good professor said, we've got to test it in war conditions. We've got to test these weapons under proper war conditions, and that's where Korea came in. The other issue with the Korean War is the POW defections that occurred. This was really the whole start of the wider concern within the administration over defections as such. The outcome of the POW studies was that they learned how potential defectors had been profiled by the Chinese, and it was decided that part of the problem was that there was no American indoctrination program for kids, as happens behind the Iron Curtain, leaving men captured unable to argue the case for freedom or resist the case for communism. One reaction to this issue was that some military brass put together their own American indoctrination programs for their troops. One such program was a little thing called Pro Blue. That was run by a certain General Edward Walker. Unfortunately for Walker, he tried to do this under Kennedy's watch. We all know how that went, and we'll be looking at that at a later date, hopefully. About halfway through this part is where I begin the biography of Oswald, and this includes a lot of new information about Edwin Ekdal, including a circumstantial case I put together that Ekdal knew the Hyde clan while he was living in New York. That takes us up to date with part 2 of the first volume. Thank you. Okay, part 3 covers the period in which Oswald and his mother Marguerite lived in New York City. It covers my work on John Pick and his stint with the Port Security Unit, which was a unit of the Coast Guard. Some of you may have come across this work in one or two other books, but it actually originated in a presentation I sent to the 2003 WEC conference, and soon after was posted online at the Education Forum, among other places. The Port Security Unit was formed to help rid the ports of alleged subversive elements and utilise the network of informants that were already in place for the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The Navy, well after the Cold War ended, finally got around to admitting that this unit never ever tried to verify any information it received, and that it actually destroyed more innocent people than the House Un-American Activities Committee did. And that's a big call. So, the bottom line here is, whenever anyone asks you to prove Oswald had any intel connections, just say 2 words: John Pick. That's all you have to say. His own brother. Pick was trained as a pharmacist, and every military hospital he worked at was involved in human radiation experiments at some stage. This begs the question of whether it was a simple coincidence that Oswald married a pharmacist from behind the Iron Curtain, who had her own family intel connections. Food for thought there, I think. The other main point of interest in part 3 is the work done on Youth House. As far as I could tell, there'd never been any in-depth research on this place in other works. So I made it a point of trying to dig up as much as I could about it. It turned out to be quite a gold mine for those who like connecting dots. It was built and funded by the Levenberg Foundation, named after a fellow called Fred Levenberg. He was related by marriage to the Strauss family of Macy's department store fame. It was members of the Strauss family who ran the foundation. Every single one of the following associations is rock solid. There is absolutely no doubt about these associations. Roger Strauss Jr. Was a founder of the publishing company Farrar, Straus and Giroux. This company was the publisher of E. Howard Hunt, and it was Strauss who gave a positive reference for his recruitment into the CIA. Donald B. Strauss. Donald's actually rented a holiday home on National Island, which was owned by a Payne company. This was also the Paynes and Ruth on her own. It was their favourite holiday destination. It There was also one stop that Ruth made on a rather circuitous trip to pick up Marina in September '63. Then we come to Nathan Strauss. He was actually an associate of Leo Cherney, who was involved with the organisation CIA front that was involved in bringing Oswald home from the USSR. Lastly, this family also built and ran the immigrant apartment block which housed the Rosenbergs during the 1940s, and it was actually the apartment manager who gave Mr. Rosenberg a reference to get into the army unit that he was working with. So that's that. There'll be more to come on some of this in later volumes, because everything that I've written up to date does get tied up neatly at the end of this, and this is no small part of that. So, but that's all coming in volume 3. Hello again. We're going to start on volume 2, part 1 now. The main focus of this is the Civil Air Patrol. When I first started posting online, it was at John McAdams' news group forum, and one thing that sticks out in my memory of those days is the determination of lone nutters to tear down certain published claims that had become widely accepted. One of those was that Dryhole Bird, Harold Bird, had been one of the founders of the CAP. The vehemence behind the denials was incredible, really, for the claim. What they insisted was that Harold had basically only formed the Texas branch of the CAP and not founded the whole organisation. This, as it happens, is not true. He was in fact a co-founder of CAP nationwide. Above and beyond that, he was actually also the co-founder of the cadet program within the CAP. So that's important because that's what Oswald was in. The reason I suspect that they did this was to limit the opportunity for Bird to know David Ferrie. That's basically often their strategy. They'll attack things to limit damage, and this is a clear example of that. But it's more than that too. His position in the CAP, that's Bird's position, would mean that he would also have been aware of Claude Meyer Sr., the father of Claude Meyer Jr. He was the commander of the Northeast Division between 53 and 55. And it was in the Northeast that word leaked in 1948 about a new program that the CAP wanted to roll out. This program essentially trained informants and placed them in a variety of industries. That was the idea behind it. And they would act as informants, and not only that, they would denominate the people they would be informing on. And beyond that, the part of the training was involved learning the Russian language and Russian culture. The CAP also sought permission to run this program from both the FBI and the CIA. Now, from where I sit, there is no need whatsoever to ask permission of the CIA if it's just a domestic program, nor would there be much need for a domestic program for recruits to learn Russian. So I, over time, sort of became more and more convinced that this program was actually the roots of the what became known as colloquially anyway, as the forced defection program. I also make the case in the book that David Ferrie was the recruiter for Oswald. I won't go into the details of that here, but that's all in the book, and I think it's a pretty good case that he was the one that recruited Oswald into such a program. The other main point in this first part of the book is that I reveal for the first time what Ruth Payne's sister was doing for the CIA. That's Sylvia Hoke. She was working undercover for the Army Air Force as a psychologist at a university on the East Coast, which where they were studying recruiting issues for the FICON program. The FICON program was one of the precursors of the U2 program. So, I mean, how many coincidences do we need to pile up here? It's we've got the sister of Ruth Payne, for God's sake, working in a program dealing with aerial surveillance, which of course is one of the main issues with Oswald and his defection. So anyway, that's all covered in the book, and that's the main points from part one. Thank you. In part two of volume 3, we commenced with a discussion on General Doolittle, who was asked by the White House to make an assessment of the intelligence community and to report back with recommendations. For me, the one recommendation of interest was as follows, and I'll just read the whole thing out to you. It is now clear that we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever means and at whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game. If the United States is to survive, long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. We must develop effective espionage and counter-espionage services and must learn to subvert, sabotage and destroy our enemies by more clever, more sophisticated and more effective methods than those used against us. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with and understand and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy, which would be his one saving grace, I guess, is that he recognised the repugnant nature of what he was saying. General Doolittle is of no little interest later in the story, in that he was on safari with Harold Byrd in Africa at the time of the assassination. That may be just a coincidence, or there may be something to it. But we'll be exploring those possibilities later. In this part, we also look at the Hungarian uprising of 1956. 2 years after the uprising was crushed by the Soviets, the CIA excused itself thusly. This breathtaking and undreamed of state of affairs not only caught many Hungarians off guard, it also caught us off guard, for which we can hardly be blamed, since we had no inside information, little outside information, and could not read the minds of the Russians. Excuse me, but that's a load of hooey. The problem with the statement is that in no way, shape or form could the CIA pretend that the uprising or the Soviet reaction to it was undreamed of. It was very, very much dreamed of. All we need to do is go back to June 1953 and read the National Security Council report titled Interim United States Objectives and Actions to Exploit the Unrest in the Soviet States, which was officially known as document number 74 NSC 158. Read that and you will understand exactly what happened. Point 2A of the report states, in East Germany and other satellite areas, where feasible, covertly stimulate acts and attitudes of resistance short of mass rebellion, aimed at putting pressure on communist authority for special reforms, discrediting such authority, and this is the important part, provoking open Soviet intervention. So while the mass rebellion may have been an unintended consequence, elsewhere in the report it also notes that the nourishment of resistance in satellite countries should be done without compromising its spontaneous nature. In any case, the ultimate objective was achieved, to wit, provoking open Soviet intervention. So basically the CIA got the outcome it was looking for. Now the purpose of doing that, I'll let you decide. There could be any number of reasons for doing that sort of thing, or provoking the Soviets in such a way. After that, I go through Oswald's Marine career. But for now, I just want to focus on one thing: Louis' hot date with the aunt of his Marine buddy, who flew over from the East Coast seemingly just to date a couple of Marines. Her name was Rosaline Quinn, and she was a flight attendant for Pan Am. It is now known that Pan Am flight crews were targets of CIA recruitment, and that should be obvious as to why that would be. Just the sheer amount of intelligence they could gather in those flights. Moreover, Rosaline had been learning Russian. This had been in preparation for the State Department Foreign Service exam. And those two things combined leave me in no doubt at all. Rosaline was CIA. Her other date was with John Donovan, who was Oswald's senior officer, who had been to the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service himself. It's just a pity that no one ever, in those early days after the assassination, or even early years, followed Rosaline's career and just found out a bit more about what became of her. Okay, that's the end of part 2. Part 3 of Volume 2 is exclusively about the Albert Schweitzer College and its US intake officer Robert Schatt. The college was owned and operated by the International Association for Religious Freedom, or the IARF, which in turn was more or less an arm of the Unitarian Church. It was an organisation, as far as I can tell, designed for the sole purpose to support fringe non-Catholic religions. It in fact garnered a lot of support from one of the more far-out religions of the day. That was the Theosophy Society. And indeed, when you look into it, Albert Schweitzer himself had an abiding interest in this quasi-religion. In the US, the college was supported by the Friends of Albert Schweitzer College, headed by one-time Bureau of the Budget chief, Percival Brundage. Later, Brundage would use his contacts and his accounting skills to set up CIA proprietors for the Cuban operations in Miami. But back to Robert Schatt for a second. He was, as I say, he was responsible for receiving all the US college applications. Although I've not been able to prove it as yet, there is evidence that Robert was related to Hitler's finance wizard, Aljamar Horace Greeley Schatt. But the really interesting part about, well, bit of information about Robert is that he was married in the Emmanuel Evangelical Church in Irvington, New Jersey. This church and its pastor, Reverend Edward Patesgold, were investigated by the very first HUAC for association with the forerunner of the American Bund, a group called FONG, Friends of New Germany. This was an organisation ordered to be formed by Rudolf Hess. The church had a sister church in what would become Israel, and it was set up for purely apocalyptic purposes. Their aim, in fact, was to bring on the apocalypse. records, genealogical records confirm that Schatz's family remained in this church, and it begs the question of his switch to a liberal church, such as the Unitarians. So with the college, we can see connections to Theosophy, to the US White House of Eisenhower, and also through the intake officer association with a pro-Nazi church, which had, visions of the Second Coming, or bringing about the Second Coming. And that's about where we end the second part of volume 2. The only other thing of interest might be that I do look at his Oswald's application to this college, and I don't think it's any coincidence that he listed on that application his favourite 3 authors as being Darwin, Norman Peale, and Jack London, three people of great interest to the Unitarian Church. Now, people wonder how Oswald found out about the church to start with. It's even more remarkable that he found out that how to write the application in such a way that it would be looked upon favourably.
Just a lonesome traveler, great historical bum, highly educated, though history tied my tongue. Came of age in the year of town, was in the year 01. That was about the biggest thing man has ever done. I worked in Kirkwood Cellar, was the year of 63. Joined the Waiters Union, but there was a joining fee. I'm the man who served the hard stuff to the secrets of their sins. That was about the biggest thing the man has ever done. I was the smoking man in Watergate, the OC bombing too. I opened up the floodgates that already come through. I fought a million battles for the safety of my throne. That was about the biggest thing the man has ever done. Beat the desert warrior, I did it with the smoke. I smashed the town-headed army with 13 minutes work. I fought the ragged leaders and did it just for fun. That was about the biggest thing the man has ever